And we are at Women's Info Center, which has been here forever in 3 days. And we live in Florida now, both of us, and at the same address since we've been living together for 36 years.
How cool is that? And could you give us your names?
Oh, that's right. I'm Barbara Gerber, and I was born in Buffalo, and I grew up here because I came to college here in Syracuse, and I never lost my roots here. That's really the circumstance for me, is Central New York. Central New York is a place where I feel like I'm at home. I'm visiting Florida. Go ahead.
I'm Nancy Osborne. Barbara and I are partners, and I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. We are at Women's Info Center on Allen Street in Syracuse, New York. Down the street or up the street, depending on where you are from. We used to live on Allen Street when with our 3 children were in Nottingham High School.
Cool. Could you tell us when you first heard about the peace encampment?
Well, we were friends with Elaine Lytell and other people here in town, politically and socially to some extent. So we were connected with Women's Info and other happenings. And so we knew about it because women's events were publicized through this organization that we're here, and because we were part of shall we say, the hippie generation of people. And as a consequence, I think we knew about it. We were very supportive of it. I know we gave money, but I have no idea how much money we gave to help people with it. It was not astounding amounts of money, of course. And we twice visited. We were really not part of the encampment. I don't think we ever stayed overnight there. But we knew what was happening, and the 2 times that I recollect that we went were when there were major protests. And you know, I mean, I can tell you that I went with trepidation about whether I would become annoyed enough to taunt them and get arrested. But I had taken a job as a manager, the dean of a division at Oswego State, and I didn't think that was probably going to go over very well if I got arrested and got into some kind of serious civil disobedience, that I might lose my job, not because they'd fire me, but because I wasn't there. And we knew other people who were doing other protests. So we went out and we did kind of stand back, and we watched and we cheered the women who were doing the actual acts of civil disobedience and trying to get across. The guns are scary.
Tell us about that.
Tell us about that.
Well, I've only had a couple of experiences where people greet you with a gun in their hands. I mean a machine gun. Now, they weren't greeting me personally, but I see this and I think, you know, if people lose it, you know, and
the only time I can think of is in Ireland.
Yes, in Ireland, and that was subsequent to this.
And all it was just guns.
Yeah, we pulled up, and of course we had a car that was rented to us in Ireland, and we went to Northern Ireland because we wanted to see what was going on. Well, the minute I opened my mouth, they dropped their guns. You know, they didn't have them up like this. But that's
because you weren't Irish. And
I sounded like an American. They knew we were just there to look, kind of. But I think that was the first time that I met that kind of, and saw personally that kind of reception of people, was surveillance with guns. and the guns were, they looked like they meant business. All you had to do was pull the trigger. It wasn't that they were, they weren't menacing people. They weren't threatening them, but they were holding those guns, and you knew darn well that if you got a little obstreperous, they could use
They
it.
were menacing in the sense that I remember that it had something to do with touching the fence, not to touch the fence. That's what I remember, and it was horrifying to me. I couldn't believe the courage that it took to reside there for any period of time. It was a very threatening kind of feeling that they were encamped somewhere where they were not understood or welcomed. And the only thing that I don't remember a whole lot about it, but one thing I remember is stopping at a restaurant to have lunch, and it happened that there were signs all over the restaurant, welcome visitors to the peace encampment. And I don't know if it was the owners of the restaurant, but I think it would be really interesting to follow up on.
That was the Castros, probably. It was.
The Castros.
Yeah, I think that was a.
They were very welcoming and supportive.
And that was probably a local family.
It was a local family, and they did take a stand because there were some people working for them. In fact, Trudy's was the woman. Her best friend, a lifetime friend, worked there with her, and refused to serve customers from the peace encampment, and that they actually broke a long friendship over that Trudy felt she had.
That's heart-rending.
But it was a matter of principle that
Yes.
Trudy felt that, look, we're a restaurant, we serve people, everyone is welcome. We don't make,
You don't make political decisions.
I just compared that kind of welcoming situation to what we knew was going on in terms of guns and
Yeah.
the military
Yeah.
presence.
Yeah, but it's funny that the peace camp is made up of kind of a vast network, or that webbing, because that turned out to be a very important place. We had meetings there about the relationship in the community and tried to work through some things. Also, when we were being listened to so frequently by the military, then we could go to Nicastros and meet down there. Although later on, the possibility of being heard even down there was the parabolic units pointed down there were probably picking up those conversations. But they did. They loaned us pots and pans. I mean, they were wonderful. And the relationship stayed for years, many, many years.
That's great.
Yeah.
It would be wonderful if you could interview some of those community individuals.
We're hoping
Some
to
of
at
whom
some
probably
point.
are gone by now.
Right.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you remember? Did you go on the land at the peace encampment?
Yeah.
All right. So, tell us a little bit about those impressions.
Well, it was let me put it this way. I'm not a connoisseur, but I know what is necessary, having been camping for years. They had a pretty good setup, as I recollect, with I think there was water outside where where you could set up a shower and stuff, and so there were basic amenities. People could come and camp sort of in the backyard, but you could see the fence of the depot there. It wasn't that far. It was a wonderful find for those folks who bought it and set it up, to find it right there, and there was a gate there too, which made it, in a sense, if you look at it from the inside the gate's point of view, they wouldn't have liked it as well. It'd be better if it were just like a double fence. But when you've got a fence with a gate and there's official people going through, it makes it reachable, without having to climb the fence. If you start climbing the fence, you can be an easy target. So I think that's part of the impression that I had. we found the same thing without the guns at the women's encampment, which we really did not go into in England. We went to visit it, and this was in the 90s. So they were still operating there, but it was not an active, because there wasn't anything for the Brits to focus on. They were focusing on what the Americans were doing there in England. But at the time we were there, the Brits were having difficulties, and the Irish were having difficulties with each other, and so they were less concerned about what the United States was doing. I think that would be a way of describing that. But it was there, and it was not, it wasn't just withering away. There were people that were there. There were women there, even in the 90s.
When in the 90s?
You're talking about Greenham Common. Greenham Common.
Yes. I didn't remember the name of it, but it was the women's encampment, and they were against nuclear stuff, and we happened to be in England, and so we got ourselves a look at it.
Uh-huh.
Why did you want to see it, and how did you find out where it was?
Well, we knew about this one here, having lived in this area, and I don't remember. We purposefully, while we were going around, we went to the big monuments.
Stonehenge?
Stonehenge, thank you. We went to Stonehenge, and I was sort of sick to my stomach about the fact that there was an Air Force base across the street from it. But, the Brits do what they have to do and the Stonehenge was not damaged in any way, but if somebody crashed a plane, they could have knocked it out. And so somehow, either through inquiry or something on a map that we had, we went to see what we could see.
I just had a remembrance that I wanted to throw in. I'm a librarian and an archivist, and one of the things I remember is how the encampment was documented by Syracuse Peace Council newsletter.
Yeah.
Which was wonderful. And I think the Syracuse New Times also, if I'm not mistaken, Walt Shepard. And it seems like Elaine Lytell wrote her remembrances of this. So I'm thinking it would be nice to have a little library or collection. Those things will eventually find their way to Schlesinger, I would hope, as supporting documentation.
Yes.
You know how to spell Lytell?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have the book that she helped do.
That's good.
Yes.
But I was just thinking about how it was that people really knew what was going on, and as I remember, the Syracuse newspapers didn't cover things too terribly fully.
Right.
Right. So when you went to the camp and to actions, knowing that you weren't ready to do civil disobedience because of jobs and so on. But do you remember anything else about the actions or your feelings at the time?
Well, it was definitely exciting. And that's what I meant by seeing the guns and everything also. It was definitely exciting in anticipation of going, and there was, it was a staged event, and everybody played a part, and they did a good job. And the women were lining up, and then I believe that we saw a couple people get over the fence without, they weren't behaving in a way that anybody felt the necessity of shooting, but they were tight on it, and I don't know for sure who they were. It was a real drama, And the drama, I think, had to do with something that I believed very strongly in, and that is, we're damn fools if we put up with this kind of behavior on the part of the military and in the name of all of us. When I was in college, the Syracuse drama department did a play that was very impressive to me, and I don't know whether it was my freshman or sophomore year, but it was Lysistrata. And and that was an interesting and a sort of a wake up that early, and that was in the early 50s, with these women all deciding that they're not going to have anything to do with men, and these are their husbands and all. And it was a Greek play. I mean, it was written way back, and it was a wonderful idea.
It was the idea of if as long as men were going to war, women wouldn't put out for them.
That's right. And the men were freaked out by it, I mean, and I of course didn't know that kind of language when I was 17 or 18 years old, but I was so impressed that I really believed they're right. That is the correct way to take life, and not to be violent.
So you had been politically involved in doing things, in your community before.
Yeah, when we
before the
lived here, we
encampment.
campaigned for women candidates.
Most of our energy was going into National Women's Studies Association because we were founding members, and so one of the things I think we tried to make sure over the years was that there were on the programs, the yearly programs for the conferences, that there was a peace and justice component, and there were many different caucuses to be a part of, and I was a part of the educators caucus, and you were part of the board, I can't remember the name, the coordinating council. So a lot of our energy was going into getting an organization going that was academic, but at the same time was activist and into communities as well. And I was the reason I mentioned the community aspect of your project is I think sometimes people don't realize that the folks out in the community are the ones who have the things to really offer if you're going to develop new curriculum about learning. And so a lot of our energy was going into National Women's Studies Association.
Well, yeah, because we got it down to the basics. It's like we got to deal with the issue of the history, the literature, all the aspects of women in the academic community, or there won't be any leaders trained. And so in that, I think in that real sense, I mean, basically, I'm an academic. That's part of my identification of myself. And I believe that we have to cultivate students, and I think we have to cultivate the development in each generation, because it's real easy to fall off the wagon in a sense. And so it's important to get people involved in activism, or you're going to get a circumstance like it sometimes looks like we have now, where the administration at federal level goes on doing what it wants to do, whether we want to have them do it or not.
And I think the thing, there's some similarities with NWSA as an organization and the project that you're working on for the Women's Encampment is you have people of all different socioeconomic categories who are involved in this, and so they have to start working out their own internal, interpersonal and intercultural issues at the same time that they're trying to do peace activism or teaching children or whatever the programs are.
So you were working on this from its kind of inception, and got to see women's studies open up in a big way.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about getting that done?
Well, the realization, I can talk to you about what it is that happened to those of us in the State University of New York. About 1969, we began to stir. A piece of data like this, the number of men and women in the percentage between the differential between the percentage of men and women accepted into college and graduating from college were despairing. To be honest, it was ridiculous. When I went to work at the college at Oswego in 1965, I was brought in there. I had a doctorate already, and I was brought in to do curriculum planning and things of that nature, as well as teach. We discovered, now it is true that Oswego had a technology education program that at that time didn't attract very many women at all. I'm proud my daughter graduated from that school and that program and got a master's degree in technology education. And it was a good mix because her father was a electrical engineer and her mother was a psychologist. So a bunch of us faculty, female faculty, got together because we discovered also that there were two people who were senior faculty who were women. Two. One full professor who was in the music department and had, a killer voice. She was one, and a big reputation. And so she was hired as a as a full professor. Or she was promoted to it, and more likely she was hired because they had to appoint her that way or not be able to pay her what she would come to work for, which would not be beans. So we start a campaign of a SUNY council of women's issues. Shortly, of course, we get meetings going amongst Buffalo State, Geneseo, Oswego, Oneonta, Albany, New Paltz, all of and Plattsburgh and Potsdam, all those schools, the women began to get excited about it through the SUNY information system in that sense. And we pulled together, I believe it was in '69, a meeting that was held at New Paltz to think about how we're going to get a council that's within SUNY working for women's issues. So that is truly what it is that enlivened me and got me involved. And because I seem to be able to get people organized reasonably well, what happens if you provide some leadership, they start treating you that way, like you're in charge. And so if you have their attention, you better get teaching. And so that seemed to work quite well. Of course, after we got it settled in the early 70s about women's employment circumstances and promotion opportunities and what have you, then we started agitating for a women's studies program. Because there were people writing in the field of history and English and other academic areas about women, women's literature, and so on. So we thought about it and had meetings and talked and met and talked some more and ended up in about 75 or 76 calling together the Women's Studies Council of any of the state institutions to get started, and then we immediately opened it up to the private schools as soon as we got ourselves organized. But we always kept the SUNY Council within the state also, within the state system. The big schools obviously had more resources and were the ones that ended up doing things bestest, firstest in that sense, and that was Buffalo and Albany, and then not too long after Binghamton. when it became part of the state system. And some work, considerable work actually, at Stony Brook. So those were the places, and by the way, our group did not include the city colleges. They had their own group. And they joined, the people that there joined the New York State, not the SUNY, but the New York State Women's Studies Organization, was pretty well organized by 77, 78.
So wait a minute, were there women's studies programs in another part of the country?
Yes.
And so
Getting along, but we were...
So you had some sort of model or something to follow that
Well,
other states doing it, or you-
actually, there were women's studies pockets in places.
Okay.
In 1977, January, a bunch of us from across the country convened in San Francisco, January of 1977, and put together a National Women's Studies Association.
Okay.
And that group
Okay.
developed their constitution right there in the meetings with propositions and proposals and principles and stuff like that. And I was privileged to bring home all of those rulings and things that had been voted on and put it together into a constitution. And then I got that opportunity again in a revision, and the last revision that I was involved with, I was chair of the committee that ran from 89 to 91, and it was voted on in 92. And the last one was modeled on the Girl Scouts, on their constitution and their process, because we're having trouble.
Hold on just a second, I just want to change this to...
I want to mention something about student involvement.
Yes, I would, yeah. So we were having difficulty with governance because, unfortunately, many of academics haven't had much experience with it. You know, and so what you have to do is get them interested and debate it. That's why a constitution takes 2 or 3 years to form, is because people have to tinker. Talk about involving
I was
them.
thinking while we were talking about SUNY, certainly there are many other institutions as well, but she just focused on State University of New York. But I think there were a number of students who were interns who did papers on the Peace Council, or the Peace Encampment. I mention this because one of the things we learned from Buffalo mostly was that students could be teachers also, and students had important tasks to do in the development of these concepts. And I have a feeling that might be something that you would want to look into to see what student papers have been written over time. And I can't say enough about how important the work you're doing, because oral histories, embedded in oral histories, are pockets of information that you will not get anywhere else. And then you weave it together in new ways. So if I didn't learn anything in National Women's Studies Association, I learned that students and academicians, students and teachers, can be colleagues together, and we learn from one another, and there is an equity there that we have rather than a dominance, and certainly that is a peace and justice concept.
Can you say more about that idea that what you can find in oral histories you won't find elsewhere? And I assume you're talking academically or just historically?
I'm thinking that one of the things we learned in women's studies is that each person's experience is unique and valuable and contributory to our understanding of who we are culturally or interculturally. And so when you're interviewed, when you as a student, if you're if you're accessing oral, I just say oral histories as an example because that's partly what it is. I think you're probably calling this, I don't know, that there will be pieces of information that can be followed up later about maybe it's something that someone wants to talk about their grandmother or their family or what's happening. It's sort of like we learned to study history or herstory. We learned to study it not through the wars and the dates, but we learned it through women's experiences of employment and unemployment and nursing babies and taking care of families. And so new pieces of information are going to be made accessible to further researchers, so that they will so that the new materials will be written with these pieces of information at hand.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of that is that many of us as human beings have information, and how many times people say, man, you really ought to write that up. Well, how many of us have written it up? But if we get into a conversation where someone is recording it, you say things and then later people say, man, that was something, that's really, I never heard anybody say, or I never read anything like that. I think that's what Nancy's talking about, and I think that is what it is that happens among women working on something.
Virginia Woolf calls it, her quote for it is something like diamonds in the dust heap. So little diamonds that you find when you're sweeping the floor, so.
Right. The women's studies programs in the universities and colleges then were there was a lot happening in the early 80s.
Yes.
And into the 80s. Are you aware of changes are there as many programs, more programs? Has that grown?
I think that most people in the college and university, higher education community colleges, all the way to doctoral granting institutions and people working in women's studies, it is an accepted area. It was not an accepted area when we first started, and there were stupid comments like, well, what do you need this for? What do you need women's studies for? And this was my interactions with the psychology department, the undergraduate psychology department. Well, okay, so want to have a class in psych of women. What do you need that for? And I say, because it's been psych of men all along, and then women are other, and it's been a shocking experience for many men and women who in past days thought, we're doing the generic history. No, you're not doing the generic history. You're doing.
It took a lot of guts for people who really believed in women's studies to make sure that it went from having one course on one campus to another course, and then an undergraduate degree, and then a bachelor's degree, then a master's, and then a doctorate. So it's been incremental, but it has been a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty. A lot of people lost their jobs because of it.
There were many
people had to be very courageous.
Where people
lost
their jobs and got canned and fought it, and it was fought at Buffalo University, and I think in Stony Brook, and that's just in the state of New York, but nationwide, many women had to fight hard to establish what it is they wanted. I felt very lucky, because when I turned to the curriculum committee chair and said, men's studies is what psychology has been about, believe me, read this outline and in the whole syllabus that I'm proposing.
I would like to say, though, that it would be important that we acknowledge that a lot of our male colleagues also put their hearts and their guts out there for women's studies. There were times over the years that I was teaching and being a librarian, I felt that some of my best sisters were the men who were
Who'd seen the light, let's put it that way.
who understood and they worked with us. So
Think of that guy from math at Plattsburgh, who used to come to New York State Women's Studies,
Faithful.
the college, the SUNY Women's Studies Council meetings. He believed in the whole business of bringing girls who had been deprived of mathematical education, bringing them along in college. And he was a delightful human being. I think his first name was John. And he came to National Women's Studies meetings too. So, I mean, there's somebody as a fine example, and from mathematics. So science people, there were really a lot of guys who came along a little late, but they didn't want to be ridiculed either. So
I want to go back to the peace encampment
Yes.
time. And if you can tell us at what point, you were still in Syracuse, at what point did you stop hearing about things going on at the encampment, or when was your sense that it was over or that you just didn't register anymore?
when there wasn't anything in a Syracuse Peace Council newsletter, which we always got,
I can't remember.
I would guesstimate that it was late 80s or early 90s that it just sort of, when I had an advantage also. We had a friend whose mother worked at Seneca Depot after World War II, when it was something else, and she grew up in Seneca Falls, and so Seneca Falls, and she knew all about when it was a naval base. That depot was a naval base, and there were submarines because Seneca Lake was very deep, and they could train them, initial training there and stuff. So then they turned it over to the Army and made an arsenal out of it, and so perfectly natural for the Army to just decide that they're going to sneak in a few hot bombs and things like that and then lie about it.
So was it your understanding that there were nuclear weapons at the Seneca Army Depot?
It was my understanding that there were nuclear weapons there.
And that was something you understood before the encampment arrived, or
I don't know.
Just somehow you knew?
I don't know. It was. I have to put it this way: for people who lived in Central New York, and which I did from 1951 on, you just knew some things, that were like local lore. Whether it was absolutely true or not, I was willing to accept it because local people said these things. It wasn't coming out of the Wall Street Journal.
Did you ever see the white deer? Did you ever see the white deer?
Yes, I did, and I remembered that after I talked to Susie on the phone, and I said to Nancy when we were driving somewhere, I got to remember the white deer. Thank you.
Yeah.
We
Tell us
saw
about
the
that.
white deer.
Tell us about the white deer.
Well, when I was a child, a preteen and teenager, people in my family went deer hunting down in the southern tier in Cattaraugus and Allegheny counties, in that area. And I learned, because that's what the kids were used for, our purpose in going deer hunting with the older people, the adults, mostly men, and my dad was one of them. You lined up, they pick an area and you line up as a team like you were searching, and it's all the kids, and you don't take anybody under 10. And you go through the woods. The people who have the guns and are going to bag a deer or so are at the other end of the patch of woods. So we come through the woods talking, laughing, singing, yelling, that is a deer drive. And if there are deer there, they will go through and maybe somebody will get lucky. So we, in a period of time around Thanksgiving, when I was that age, we would go down there and stay with my aunt and uncle and go deer hunting 3 or 4 days. And almost always there were deer, multiple deer, by that meaning 3 or 4 for the family, and they were carved up and split, and we took them home to the butcher and got them frozen and what have you.
Did you ever have a gun in your hand?
Yeah, by the time I was 12, I had a gun, and it was like small shells, not a big, it was a shotgun, is what you use. Anyway, I went with my Aunt Marjorie, just the two of us, of an afternoon, and we both had guns, and we're walking and everything, and 5 or 6 deer, and it was near Cuba, New York, 5 or 6 deer appear. Neither one of us could bring the gun up to our shoulders and shoot it. So we didn't get anything, and that was, in a sense, a transformative experience to me. I was almost 13, I think. And so, yeah, and so having, all that is by way of saying, having that experience, when I saw the white deer, and they're albinos, that's all there is to it. They're albino deer.
Where did you see them?
At Seneca.
Through the fence you...
I think it was through the fence. I can't say absolutely. They might have been out. I don't know.
And you saw one or several, or do you remember?
I saw 2, and they were not together. I mean, it's slightly different.
And in the time that you had been around deer hunting growing up, you had never seen a white deer out?
Right. And I have attributed that to the nuclear stuff.
How so?
Well, because I know that radiation changes your sperm and eggs. And so you're just as likely to get a freak situation. Although albinism is not a lethal change in all species. And so you get white deer, you get white dogs and pigs and what have you. I've seen that too. So, but the white deer, that was the first time I ever saw a white deer like that.
Yeah. I've heard people say it's not that they're not albino because their eyes are not pink.
Son of a gun, I didn't know
They're
that.
brown eyes.
I didn't have binoculars, and they
Yeah,
were a ways
yeah.
away.
Yeah. So
So it's not albinism,
right.
which
Well,
is
that's what I think. I don't know.
well.
Right, it's not, that's true. They're not considered albino. That's
Right.
not the medical or whatever. you
Okay,
call
but
it.
but something mutated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was that. Thank you for asking that question. I would have knocked myself up against the head, when I got out in the car and I said, "Oh my God, I forgot to say anything about that." It was startling. Can I have some water?
Mm-hmm. And were either of you, after that time, a part of large protests or civil disobedience of any sort anywhere?
I don't know.
I during the early 80s, I was so busy getting started professionally. I just remember the struggle that I had. I taught Introduction to Feminism for 7 years, and each time it was a struggle about who's going to teach and who's going to pay for it and is it going to happen, and we have to have it because it's the foundation course for women's studies, but if we don't have it, will we have women's studies? So I don't think that I was really aware of what was going on in Seneca Falls too much, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I was probably afraid of being too public. And that's one of the reasons I think I have a lot of respect for women who have put their themselves on the line, because I mean there have been times that I know I have not done that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I was doing other things.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it takes all of the things being done.
Right.
But also it takes a lot of courage to even go to an action
It does.
when you know the possibility of getting caught up in something can happen, and that you do not want your job jeopardized or your reputation, you know. So I think it takes courage to do that.
Yeah, and
Very much
Dan and
so.
Doris Sage got arrested and they got tied up with stuff for 6 or 8 months, and those kinds of things that occur. I marched in Peace March and some other stuff here in Syracuse in the 60s, and got tear gassed on Marshall Street and some other things. And I had my 2 kids. I had 2 kids with me at the time, and we came down to Marshall Street, and there were people with guns on the roofs. And it was anti-war, but I really don't remember exactly what it was all about. But we were taking it to the stadium in connection with the football stuff and picketing there. And that is all I remember about it. I don't have those details in my mind. So I'd done that, I'd been tear gassed, and then the last real marches that we did were the marches in Washington. I won to go to for the plea for abortion to be made available and not a crime. That I marched in Washington. But then it was the gay and lesbian marches, and Nancy and I went to 2 of those. So that I have been involved in other protest things, but not a heck of a lot.
And Nancy, when you said that you didn't want to be too public, can you talk a little bit more about what that was about for you?
Part of my earlier life, I was Methodist, and our minister of the Methodist Church was marched in Selma. And he was a very elegant man. He was well educated, and I respected him a lot. And I remember hearing how there was nowhere for him to go to the bathroom. And that may not seem like much, but I grew up in the South where you had some decorum. I suppose you have it in the North as well. I don't mean that, but I just remembered the feeling of someone who is that important putting himself out in the way that he did. I just thought to myself, I couldn't do that. I was pretty shy. It took me a long, long time to find my voice in women's studies and in my profession. And I think I was really fearful. I don't know. I read all I could about Martin Luther King, and I know, and I would read what the possibilities were and what could happen to me. And I think I was just fearful, and I would like to do some of that a little differently. But so I try to speak now when I can, when the opportunity arises. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that.
Having trouble with that door? Just slam it. There you go. Way to go. So another question I had, if you can, either of you maybe just can comment on the importance or the prevalence or something about lesbians in terms of making history or herstory, women's studies, but also activism. With your experience, if you can speak about the role of lesbianism.
One of the caucuses that I was involved in National Women's Studies Association was the Educators Caucus. That wasn't the name of it.
Pre-K-12.
Pre-K through 12, and year after year I would go to conferences where it was very clear that the only time that some of those usually young women could speak about what was important in their lives was when they would come to a conference far across the country, and they could talk about it because they were losing their jobs. And I think what we have now is a lot of gay and lesbian young people who are committing suicide and killing
Still.
themselves still. So we have a great deal of work to do. I'm not sure if that answers
That answers some of it.
part of it.
Definitely
Yeah.
answers some of it. I think also it's important to note that when NOW was organized, there was a flurry of concern and activity about the lesbians in NOW, and essentially the same thing, although those of us who knew about that learned our lessons early. And in women's studies, which was National Women's Studies, not founded until 1977, we were concerned about it enough that we did not,
Oh, my water.
I'm sorry, yeah, we did not create a situation where people had to come out or hide either. And I think, of course, one of the things that you find in academia is that people who've got often in the past, particularly people who've got the energy and the devotion to the notion about career, which was tough to carry off in the 60s, because they were still the vestiges of, well, you know, if you're going to have kids, you are going to have to, that kind of stuff. How can you do both? That notion of having a career and being a family person and having kids and all was really knocking heads. It was probably easier to do it with people in the university community because they don't have absolute hours. You got to be there, go in the principal's office, drop your card in, you know, and so on, and out like you were on a factory. In some places that was still the case. So I think you saw I think we saw a recognition amongst those of us who became increasingly clear, even though we weren't when we first started our younger life, that we were lesbians, was the notion that there's a lot of us here and we're not going to make proud of it because we don't want to drive the heterosexual women out because they have brains and they can teach and they can do good research and all that sort of stuff. So we were really, for many historians and English lit people, a haven in the sense of validation of themselves. We did have some moments of those of us who had children in interaction with the women who were smart sooner in age about having these kids, and you know, how can you, the questions that were asked low in tone, you know, don't you just hate men and things like that? And it was, well, not really, but I just don't love them. And so that's a different situation. And we had a pretend little caucus of those of us who had kids. I mean, we didn't really organize it that way, but it was, you know, those of us with kids get together and talk about the kids.
Now, what was your question about lesbians?
Lesbians,
Ask
was it an
again.
issue?
I need to revisit the question.
I'm not sure if I can remember, but just commentary on lesbian role in
Well,
women's studies, women's activism.
the lesbians
For the
carried the
reasons you're
heavy
speaking about.
load because they were collectively interested in this work, and they felt it was an honorable thing to do. And I mean, some of the biggest contributors to the nonprofit institution National Women's Studies were lesbians who didn't have to save some money to send their kids to college and stuff. I think that, do you have any other things you want to
I've
add?
been thinking lots of things, but they flittered away. Sorry.
It's a
Throw
drag.
it away, bring them back, get your
Yeah.
butterfly net.
Yes, right.
I was thinking of we live in Florida now, and we went to Naples to see the Laramie Project. And Naples is a pretty well-off community, you know, and it was a very small group of people, and there was never anything in any of the newspapers at all about it. It was almost as though the people that were there just went, and they were there for the afternoon theater and everything. And yet when we traveled west, we traveled through Laramie, and there's now people acknowledging in Laramie what happened, you know, to that young boy. And it just seems that our work is not done. Our peace and justice work is not done when people can be killed for their sexual orientation, and
I think
and the fact that probably many of our soldiers that are coming home from Afghanistan and Iran, they're not getting the kind of medical help that they need. They are, as long as they stay in the service, but if they get discharged, they're not getting the kind of therapy they need, for some of them who need 5 different kinds of therapists. But I think that some of them are gay and some of them are lesbians, and that's never mentioned. And how can you not be able to mention a huge part of who you are, especially if you've been hurt for your country?